I miss the MCU, and I'm sure when I say that, most of you know what I mean, but I'm sure there's also some of you who are thinking, John, the MCU's still going, there's all sorts of new stuff to watch. And you're right, and I do. I have watched every single MCU entry from Iron Man to Deadpool and Wolverine, and I intend on keeping up with the franchise, but when I say I miss the MCU, I mean I miss this.
Yeah, I had a date.
Then finish it. Because I'm with you to the end of the line.
We are Groot.
I could do this all day.
Do you truly think so little of me?
Loki, I thought the world of you.
The Infinity Saga, or more specifically, Iron Man through Avengers Endgame. I specify because Spider-Man Far From Home is technically part of the Infinity Saga, but it would make more sense thematically and release-wise if it was the first entry of the Multiverse Saga, so that's what I consider it. Sorry, Scorsese, but the MCU is a staple of film. It is a piece of movie making and storytelling that will be remembered forever. It is so impactful and so memorable that every single studio on the planet attempts to turn every franchise into the next MCU. And some studios try this not once, not twice, but 3 whole times. Frickin' Dune got a spin-off prequel show because God forbid we just make a trilogy of movies and call it a day. Do I have anything against Dune Prophecy? No, I actually think the show looks pretty good, and I still need to watch it, but it is an easy example to point to. Back to the MCU though, it is not at all a hot take to say that Marvel has dropped off post-Endgame. They still release some good stuff. WandaVision, Loki, Spider-Man No Way Home, Shang-Chi, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and Deadpool and Wolverine are all clear examples that Marvel can still reach the heights they were once at, but it's just not the same as it once was. There is magic to the Infinity Saga that we have been missing ever since. Not just in Marvel, but in storytelling in general. It feels like the strengths of the MCU were ignored by everyone in their attempts to copy it. And yes, that applies to Marvel as well. The things that made the Infinity Saga great are the things that make the Multiverse Saga bad. Let's knock this one out of the way first, because despite the fact that this is a 22-movie saga, I feel like I have the least to say about this point. Marvel breaks its movies down into phases, with the Infinity Saga making up the first 3. However, there is something they did with this saga that they did not do with the Multiverse Saga, and that is establishing a purpose for each phase. People always ask the question, and I'm going to ask it once again in this video, what are phases 4 and 5 about? You have a show about Wanda moving on from her grief and becoming Scarlet Witch, and then a show 1 month later about Sam becoming Captain America. This makes enough sense, focusing on the legacy of the heroes we lost as the characters they meant the most to figure out how to move on in the world without them. But then we get a show about Loki finding out about Kang the Conqueror, and then a movie about a character that's dead, meaning it can't exactly tie into the point of what it seems like those first couple entries were. And while it seems like the first season of Loki's supposed to be kicking off the main story of the next saga, before we can get a follow-up to it, we get an animated series that doesn't even deliver on its promise, a martial arts movie that contains to this day the only setup the Multiverse Saga has given us about a new Avengers movie, Eternals, a movie that very clearly wishes it wasn't in the MCU, and let's be honest, we'll never see any of these characters again. A fun Christmas show, a Spider-Man movie that uses the multiverse to provide the audiences with the fan-servicey third act they seem to want so bad, a show that doesn't reference the MCU at all and vice versa, a Doctor Strange movie that doesn't know if it wants to be an MCU movie or a Sam Raimi movie, a show about Miss Marvel that seems more concerned with setting up mutants than the actual thing the saga's supposed to be about, a Thor movie so bad people never want to see the character again, I Am Groot, a show that's remembered for 2 things, being a disappointment and giving us Daredevil, yet another character to follow, a Black Panther sequel that loses all the nuance and subtlety of its predecessor and again has nothing to do with anything that came before, two very well-regarded holiday specials, one of which is a very early tease for Midnight Suns despite the fact that we haven't set up the multiverse yet, and finally, the movie Kang is actually in, and killed 2 hours later. In a movie so disliked that Marvel decided to cancel their plans altogether and now use a villain that has not been mentioned by name, shown, or been teased at all, less than 2 years before the Avengers movie that's supposed to conclude the saga, directed by the guys who made Infinity War and Endgame and starring Robert Downey Jr. because we screwed up early and now it's too late to fix it, but if the audience sees things they're familiar with, they'll show up. Do you see the problem here? Compare this to the Infinity Saga. Each phase is clearly defined, with each movie connecting into the next in a seamless and important way. Phase 1 is about the world being introduced to these heroes for the first time, slowly realizing they're all connected to each other and fighting for the same thing despite not knowing it, and it culminates in them all assembling to deal with the thing they have all been unintentionally fighting against this entire time. Phase 2 serves as a bridge between phases 1 and 3, focusing on the aftermath of what the Avengers means. Tony Stark is full of PTSD because an alien army came to Earth, and he's now working tirelessly to be ready for when a bigger threat arrives. Thor is taking this opportunity after becoming a full-on hero to fix the Nine Realms and learn where his true place in the universe is. And Steve Rogers joins S.H.I.E.L.D. because it's the biggest sense of normalcy he could find after coming out of the ice, and it gives him a reason to be ready to fight. It also tests the characters, forcing Tony to face his mistakes in a way he's never had to before, Thor having to risk everything he loves for the greater good, and Steve, a man of order and honor, coming face to face with corruption and betrayal. But because they've now introduced the world to the Avengers, Phase 2 is able to build the world out, giving us new characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man. And at first, while it seems like they're disconnected, Ant-Man makes a point to show how Scott connects into the larger world, while Guardians establishes their connection through the Infinity Stones, and it all sets the stage for Phase 3. Phase 3 being when the conflict with the Infinity Stones grows, and even the projects that don't have anything to do with Infinity Stones make it clear that everything in this franchise exists for a reason. Infinity Stones are not crucial to the plot of Civil War in any way, but Infinity War does not work without Civil War. We know the Guardians will meet the Avengers. We know Spider-Man will help fight Thanos. Ragnarok starts with Thor mentioning looking for Infinity Stones, and Doctor Strange has an Infinity Stone. Black Panther gets his own solo movie, and 2 months later they bring him and Wakanda back as an important component of Avengers Infinity War. Everything built off everything before it, giving audiences the sense that each entry was important. Something you will not see Marvel do now. Try to tell me who the Avengers will consist of in Avengers Doomsday, because I sure as hell can't. But in the Infinity Saga, it was made pretty clear that there's a reason every single hero is here. Nothing in the Infinity Saga ever felt like homework. Nothing ever felt like a spin-off, even though most of the movies technically are. They felt more like episodes of a long-running TV series or issues in a comic book run where the characters and plotlines were constantly growing, shifting, and expanding rather than individual entries that would one day be followed up on. The first time a plotline in the Multiverse Saga was followed up on was with the release of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness when it brought back Wanda Maximoff and the Darkhold. But there were 9 projects released between those two things, and none of those 9 projects were followed up on in that time frame. But it's not just that it was a singular, long, coherent story. It was a good story. When we used to go to the theater for these movies, we were excited to see what happened next, and we were excited to see how the characters grew and how their relationships changed. We were excited to see how they world built off what happened previously and used it to their advantage. We were excited to see how it all tied together and see how someone like Rocket Raccoon connected back to Steve Rogers. Everyone and their grandparents were excited for a new MCU movie. I vividly remember my mom telling me how excited she was about Endgame, and I remember my dad and I sitting down ready for the Super Bowl spot for the upcoming Marvel movie every single year. Sometime between this
I am Iron Man.
and
I am Iron Man.
we all grew up. And no matter how hard they try, Marvel will never be able to deliver something quite as emotionally powerful as Avengers!
Assemble.
Ever again. And that leads into point number 2. This is the big boy. If you were to ask me to pinpoint the single biggest problem with Marvel post-Endgame, it's the lack of interesting and compelling characters. I could do scene comparisons all day, but quite frankly, I don't want to. There's enough of those out there. Instead, I just want to look at the brilliant writing at the core of the Infinity Saga's characters and why it makes them some of the most compelling and memorable characters of all time. I would like to remind everyone that Thanos, a purple nutsack who collects rocks, frequently finds himself on all-time greatest villain lists up there with the likes of Hannibal Lecter and Darth Vader. And it's not just because he won at the end of the movie. The Infinity Saga predominantly focuses on 3 characters: Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor. These 3 make the most appearances, they get the most solo movies, and the stories of their films are often the ones that have the biggest impact on the overarching plots of each phase. Iron Man appears 10 times throughout the Infinity Saga, Captain America appears 7, and Thor also appears 7, but it's 8 if you count the Doctor Strange post-credits scene, that I would like to point out is followed up on 1 year and 3 projects later. This is another thing that Marvel has an issue with now. Main characters that constantly appear and actually make the world feel connected. Once Chris Evans appears for the first time, he pops up in the MCU every single year until his character dies. And I'm aware he didn't technically die in Endgame, but it's treated like a death, so that's what we're calling it. And these 3 core characters do something that Hollywood has somehow forgotten about: character arcs. The Steve Rogers that goes into the ice and the Steve Rogers that lifts Mjolnir are not the same Steve Rogers. He goes on a massive journey between those 2 events. Kevin Feige once said that Cap was always able to lift the hammer. He was just pretending he couldn't in Age of Ultron so as to not hurt Thor's feelings. And Kevin, I love you. You gave me my childhood, but this is the biggest load of bullshit I've ever heard. Steve Rogers wasn't able to lift the hammer in Avengers Age of Ultron, and claiming he was able to completely negates his entire character arc. You're now telling me that Cap didn't grow into the man we see in Endgame. He was always that man. This is like saying Han shooting Greedo makes him less of a hero. That's the point. We see him grow into that hero. And they did the same thing with Loki. Marvel confirmed that in the first Avengers movie, Loki was under the control of the Mind Stone. This was clearly because Ragnarok came out and Loki was a hero, so they said, well, that doesn't make any sense. Let's say he was good the whole time, but he was being mind-controlled. No, he wasn't. Stop lying. The reason he's a hero in Ragnarok and Infinity War is because he grew and changed into one. Him dying to save his brother doesn't mean he wasn't an awful person at the start of his arc. Dear Marvel, this is something we like to call a redemption arc. Removing that crucial piece of his arc ruins his character. So sorry, Marvel, but no. I'm not listening to you on this one. But a lot of the media we love tends to make that mistake nowadays. The lack of any semblance of a character arc leading to uninteresting ones. And yes, this is the Multiverse Saga's biggest problem. In the last 6 or 7 years, studios have gotten into the habit of treating the audience like children, feeling the need to spoon-feed them everything and being afraid to take risks because they're afraid people won't get it. It's why Marvel got scared and abandoned Kang. It's why The Rise of Skywalker feels like it was made on an assembly line. It's why Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, a movie made by James freaking Mangold, feels so surface level and inconsequential and does nothing with one of fiction's most iconic heroes. It's why most shows nowadays have the most basic cause and effect conflicts with weak characters and predictable plots. The reason studios created focus groups to test what they put out is so that they can make sure they appeal to the lowest common denominator. Believe it or not, the reason we haven't gotten a new Pirates of the Caribbean movie in 7 years isn't because of Johnny Depp. It's because Disney's too afraid of taking the risks necessary to make a new Pirates of the Caribbean movie. But you know what a focus group would have prevented us from getting?
This isn't gonna change what happened. I don't care. He killed my mom.
The Infinity Saga is dripping with so much good character work that it's honestly overwhelming. Every character, and I mean every character, has such a well-rounded and well-constructed character arc that seeing this shot alone can be enough to bring a tear to someone's eye. This does not mean everyone gets the best treatment. I don't need to get into Hulk because there are 20,000 videos already explaining that, but if I put these two photos side by side, I guess we can say he did change, which is more than I can say for most modern characters. Much like many of you, I went to see Black Panther: Wakanda Forever when it came out, and the most talked about piece of that movie is Riri Williams, aka Ironheart. At the start of the film, Riri is a smartass genius who doesn't care about anyone other than herself. She builds all these great things and she doesn't care about how everything works out, just so she knows that she's a genius. She kicks off very similarly to Tony Stark, and it's a clever place to start her character. It makes her super unlikable, and it meant the only direction she could go was up. However, then the Queen dies, and Riri was almost solely responsible. Yes, Nakia killed Italo Khanil and Ramonda sent her to infiltrate Talokan, but all of this happens because of Riri Williams. This is basically her fault. And I was expecting some sort of revelation for Riri, something making her realize she needs to be more selfless and she needs to be more careful, that there's more to the world than just her, and she's witnessing for the first time that everything she was warned against happened. But instead, Riri proceeds to be a smartass about Shuri eating the heart-shaped herb, works alongside the dead queen's daughter without so much as an "I'm sorry," builds a vibranium Iron Man suit, and then just goes back to living her normal life. She doesn't learn anything, she doesn't change, she's the exact same character at the beginning of the film as she is at the end. And when you do this, why should I, as an audience member, care about this character? Contrast this to Tony Stark in his first movie alone. He gets kidnapped and realizes the dangers of what he's doing. Yinsen dies to save him, and in return, Tony shuts down the weapons manufacturing division of Stark Industries and then builds the Iron Man suit in secret to not appear as a hypocrite before realizing his weapons are still being used. So he takes this thing he built selfishly and suits up to go save the innocent people he put in harm's way, realizing there is more to life than just himself and that he can do something with his gifts beyond just sitting in his workshop and throwing Playboy parties, something that dictates his entire character for the rest of the story. Tony starts off very selfish and learns to work with others. Captain America learns to be a leader and a hero. Thor learns that he stands for something bigger than just being king, and this all culminates in the Avengers, where we see their arcs for the phase each wrap up and pay off. And something modern movies tend to forget is that giving your character an arc does not change their core traits. Tony Stark is a narcissist, but sending him on this huge journey of self-discovery doesn't take away the fact that he's a narcissist. It just changes our view of what that trait does to him. Captain America is still the selfless hero he was in his previous appearances. His arc in The Winter Soldier just makes him more jaded as a person and not trusting of authority and power, an arc that follows him into Civil War. But through all of this, he is still a selfless hero. It's the way the arcs bounce off each other that makes them interesting. Look at Civil War, a movie where Tony and Steve are both trying to protect the world, but Tony thinks that needs to be done through structure and power, whereas Steve knows that doing it that way would lead to the same problem he saw in The Winter Soldier. And that puts them at odds, and we see the consequences of them both refusing to budge in Infinity War before coming back together in Endgame, because they realize that their opposing ideas only cause damage, and they have to find a middle ground and work together to get it done. And then there's Thor. A man who wants to be king and almost destroys his society to do so, learns that there are more important things in his life and takes it upon himself to go fix the Nine Realms and usher in a new era of peace. And once he's finally offered the throne, he realizes
The brutality, the sacrifice, It changes you. I'd rather be a good man than a great king.
And then we get to Thor Ragnarok, a movie where Thor must take the throne, and when he finally sits down, it feels earned. I don't necessarily love everything they do with Thor between Ragnarok and Endgame, but when he realizes at the end of Endgame that he has done all he can for these people and someone else should take the throne, it serves as a satisfying conclusion to his arc. And in the Infinity Saga, Marvel was very smart about who they introduced and when. After Phase 1, they were able to expand their universe out, and not only was every character able to carve out their own piece of the universe, they also each had a reason for being introduced at the time they did. Guardians of the Galaxy released right before Age of Ultron. It has nothing to do with the Avengers, but it shows us heroes outside of Earth and also serves as an introduction to the Infinity Stones, which is then paid off in the next movie where the Mind Stone is a crucial plot point and Thor has the vision of Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet. Right after Age of Ultron, Ant-Man is introduced, a project that serves as an epilogue to Avengers and follows through on how the world has changed after everything that's happened since the Avengers first came to be. And the most important part of Ant-Man is that they knew they were going to put him into Civil War, the next project right after Ant-Man. Right after Civil War, Doctor Strange was released, a movie that made its existence known pretty clearly.
Best not to walk the streets wearing an infinity stone.
A what?
Spider-Man and Black Panther are notable exceptions here because they were the first franchise headliners that weren't introduced in their own movies. But that's okay, because there's a reason those two characters were introduced in Civil War. Black Panther's connected to the plot so tightly that if you take him out, Civil War doesn't work. As for his solo movie, they established the world of Wakanda and T'Challa having to take his place as king, learning to be the ruler his people need, not just following in his father's footsteps. And it pays off because T'Challa lets Rogers and crew go there in Infinity War. As for Spider-Man, well, we're gonna come back to Spider-Man. And of course, there's Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel is introduced at the right time. She's teased in Infinity War. She gets her own solo movie where we learn everything about her past and where she's been this entire time before she joins up with the group in Endgame. Every character has such an important reason for existing, and despite everyone belonging to a separate corner of the universe, everyone feels connected and important. The sequels make perfect sense too. Ant-Man serves as an epilogue to Age of Ultron, and Ant-Man and the Wasp serves as an epilogue to Infinity War. Guardians 1 brings the team together, and Guardians 2 teaches them what it means to be a family and not just a bunch of coworkers, which makes their part of Infinity War more sad, because when Gamora dies, it doesn't feel like they lost an ally, it feels like they lost a family member. I want you to tell me what purpose there was for Miss Marvel to release between Doctor Strange 2 and Thor 4. And there is, of course, the MCU's take on Peter Parker. Peter Parker, in the Infinity Saga, is perfect. MCU Spider-Man is a huge point of conversation, but none of the problems with this take on the character actually pop up until his second film. His introduction in Civil War is such a brilliant piece of writing.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
He's not Iron Boy Jr. in Spider-Man Homecoming. He just wants to be. The entire lesson of that movie is Peter learning he doesn't need to try to be an Avenger. He needs to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. That movie has two of my favorite moments ever put into a Spider-Man movie. Peter leaves the homecoming dance and the girl he really likes because stopping Vulture is more important than his own happiness. And of course, come on, Peter. Come on, Spider-Man. He is such a perfectly written character in that movie. And in Avengers Infinity War, this character is introduced in the most hype way possible. Peter sees the spaceship in the sky, and without skipping a beat, he goes to deal with it. And the entire reason he ends up in space is because there's nothing in the universe more important than where he is right now. Do you guys see why I miss these movies? Anyway, let's talk about the third point. Yeah, Avengers Endgame is getting its own point, because this movie does something that Marvel seemed to forget a whole 3 months later. The title of this movie contains the word end. Stories are not allowed to end anymore. It's one of my biggest complaints with just about everything. It's impossible to care about something because it'll either outlive you or get canceled because they greenlit 9 sequels and 10 spin-offs before the first one even came out, and it didn't make $1 billion. And yes, I'm aware the MCU didn't end, but the thing with Endgame is that it was designed to be an ending. This movie doesn't set up a single thing. It didn't have a post-credit scene. It was devoted solely to ending the story and the arcs of the characters we had been following for 11 years. And you're probably thinking, John, the movie pretty overtly set up Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and Loki. No, it didn't. The movie ends with Thor going off with the Guardians to find Gamora. That's not a setup. That's just telling us that the Guardians are going on another adventure and Gamora's out there somewhere. As for the Loki setup, this is less of a setup than the Guardian setup. Sure, maybe the Russos were told by Marvel, hey, we want Loki to get his own project, can you figure that out? And they did, but no one thought this was a setup when they saw the movie. Hell, it was so subtle and clever that when they announced the show, people were confused as to how it existed. If they were in fact supposed to set up the Loki show, it's one of the points of the scene, not the point of the scene. I'm getting distracted. Let me get back to talking about the movie. Avengers Endgame is such an insane film. It was a movie that not only had to serve as the sequel to Infinity War, which is already a difficult task, it had to wrap up the entire saga people had been following for just over a decade, which is even more difficult of a task. And the movie also had to conclude the stories of the following characters. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, Hulk, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Pepper Potts, Falcon, Bucky Barnes, the Guardians of the Galaxy, Scarlet Witch, Ant-Man the Wasp, Black Panther, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, Captain Marvel, and Thanos. And the movie's good. You don't often see Avengers Endgame at the top of people's MCU rankings. Hell, you don't usually see Endgame as people's best ranked Avengers movie. But everyone looks back on this movie very fondly because they were able to wrap everything up in a mostly satisfying way. In a world where the concluding chapters of stories usually drop off, making people feel they've wasted their time, almost 6 years on, Endgame manages to stand out as the one that made it all worth it. By the end of this movie, Thanos is dead. Tony Stark made the ultimate sacrifice to defeat him, losing his own life in the process. Steve Rogers went back in time to grow old, passing the mantle to Sam. Thor's off with the Guardians of the Galaxy after finding a new purpose in life. The Guardians themselves are on a quest to find Gamora, who they know is out there. Hulk finally fulfilled his entire purpose for existing. Scott's able to go home and spend time with his family, as is Hawkeye. Peter returns to being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man he's supposed to be. T'Challa's finally reunited with his family and able to be the proper king of Wakanda now that there are no threats at their borders. Wanda seems to have come to terms with Vision's death, just as Hawkeye seems to be at peace with Natasha's, and the movie literally ends with all 6 of the original Avengers signing off in the credits. So the only question that remains is, where do you go from there? Well, you don't. Endgame wrapped up everyone's story with a perfect little bow. Even Captain Marvel, who had first appeared a month and a half prior, felt like her story had been wrapped up despite the fact that she has no screen time in Endgame. The reason Endgame succeeded is the reason the multiverse saga isn't working. You see, when you bill your movie as the concluding chapter of a story and you design it to be such, omitting any post-credit scenes or setup for future stories, you run the risk of a common storytelling trope. It's called running out of story to tell. The writers of Phases 4 and 5 had to basically create conflicts that are non-existent because Marvel insisted on keeping this franchise that had ended going. Wanda is at peace with Vision's death at the end of Endgame, but 2 weeks later, that's when WandaVision takes place. She enslaves an entire town to be with him before becoming a villain in Doctor Strange. Sam accepts the mantle of Captain America, and then a few months later he gives up the shield just to accept the mantle of Captain America again. Spider-Man immediately dives into a multiverse-ending story in the follow-up to a movie that should have just been an epilogue, but insisted on setting up sequels. And while all this is happening, Loki's fighting a threat that poses a bigger danger to existence than Thanos did. But oh wait, he's not really, because people didn't like Quantumania, so we're not doing that. And all of this is now building up to the eventual return of Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, and the Russo brothers in Avengers Doomsday and Avengers Secret Wars. My god, what is this saga? But the Infinity Saga, Iron Man through Avengers Endgame, as the story was meant to be, is such a wonderful story. An 11-year journey that we went on where we followed these characters' journeys from beginning to end. We saw them rise, we saw them fall, and we saw everything in between. We learned how to care, how to love, how to stand up for what's right with all of them. These used to be not just the most popular movies every year, but were among people's favorites every year. We planned our lives around these movies. Everyone was eager to see these movies. They were these huge events that everyone, and I do mean everyone, was talking about. None of us will ever forget where we were and how we felt when this trailer first dropped.
There was an idea to bring together a group of remarkable people.
The Infinity Saga was a huge piece of history, and it was a massive part of everyone's lives. No one in my family was nearly as interested in these movies as I was. The term casual exists almost solely because of them, yet all of them insisted on seeing these movies right when they came out. To many, the MCU ended right here. And everything else after it just felt like this weird side material and bonus content where you can pick what you want to watch and it's just there if you want more. Because ultimately, that's exactly what the Multiverse Saga is. It's not all bad. At the time of making this video, Daredevil Born Again has released 3 episodes, and I'm loving that show so far, and every week I grow increasingly more impatient waiting for the next episode. But when I look at Marvel's upcoming slate, I find myself struggling to get excited for most of this. I'll obviously watch all the movies, and I have a lot of hope for both Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four, but be honest, how many of you remember that a new Captain America movie came out a month ago? I miss the MCU, but that doesn't mean I won't still have it. Once a year, for as long as I can remember, I've watched these movies, and I can continue to do so. No one is taking those 22 movies away from me. It'll be with me until the day I die. Every second of every one of these movies, even the bad parts, and trust me, there are some really bad parts, mean something to me, as I'm sure they do to everyone else. But man, do I miss it. There's a strong chance that we will never get to feel what we felt going into these movies ever again. And I miss that feeling. When a Marvel movie came out, nothing else in the world mattered. For a few hours, it felt as if world peace had been achieved. But I'll always have that. I'll always have these characters, and I'll always have the Infinity Saga. And that's all I need.